Hello and welcome to Viking.TV from me and Diamond here in Britain at a once-in-a-century moment. The death of Queen Elizabeth II became a global event. So sad, historic, and one that's probably made us all reflect a little bit on our own mortality because it feels like she's been with us forever. But it also became a celebration of a life well lived and maybe a reminder of how life goes on. It continues with a new generation. I, for one, still can't quite believe it. I speak to you now from my home after a week of being in London, surrounded by people from all over the world. Many have come from the USA, Australia, New Zealand, from all over Europe. People who literally heard the news and booked flights and got here in time to say goodbye to a woman whose influence and importance has turned out to be more than they ever thought. People just wanted to pay homage. In the streets around Parliament Square, Buckingham Palace, Westminster Abbey, you could smell the overwhelming scent of floral tributes, heavy in the air. There were carpets of flowers everywhere. You could hear the buzz of solemn excitement. It was stunning. The Queen died at the age of 96 in Balmoral Castle, where she always loved to spend the summer. And because of that, Scotland became very involved in what was called Operation Unicorn. It was always planned, just in case she did die whilst in Scotland. And it became the first stage of her lying in state in Holyrood Palace near Edinburgh Castle, where Mary Queen of Scots once lived. The Queen then lay in state in Westminster Hall, right next to Big Ben, which is, by the way, the name of the bell atop Elizabeth Tower. And Westminster Hall, of course, was where her own mother and father once lay in state, almost literally where her body was held in vigil by soldiers, yeomen of the guard, her children, and even her grandchildren, while they're the same stone flags upon which Charles I was made to kneel as he was tried and sentenced to death, and then going back even further in time, also where Thomas More was tried and sentenced too. 2 years before even that, in 1533, Westminster Hall was where Anne Boleyn held her wedding banquet. She was already 6 months pregnant with Henry VIII's child, who was born 3 months later, in September 1533, and she became Elizabeth I. And so centuries on, Queen Elizabeth II takes her place in history, the longest reigning monarch ever in Britain. After her state funeral, which was attended by world leaders, witnessed by billions of people all over the globe, the largest ever television event, they reckon, more than half the world's population apparently watched it. The Queen was then taken from the world's glare to family, to Windsor Castle, to lie in the family vault. But why did she matter so much? Why does she matter so much? How do you place her in our vast human history? Let me introduce you now to somebody who can probably do just that. He's former BBC Royal Correspondent, Michael Cole. Lovely to see you, Michael. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's a great pleasure and a privilege, Anne. You know, what we saw in London was majestic. I have never seen anything like it, but then nobody has ever seen anything like it. It was simply magnificent. The solemnity, the ceremonial, it was perfect, and there was a sense of completion. You mentioned that the Queen died at Balmoral. She was brought by plane, a huge Globemaster plane. When I saw that coming through the gloom and landing at Northolt, a Royal Air Force Battle of Britain base to the west of London, there was a sense of full circle, because that aircraft stopped at precisely the point where she arrived back in Britain. Her father, George VI, died in the night in February 1952, and she was on safari in Africa. And she came back to London in a BOAC plane, if you remember BOAC. The plane stopped in Rome. Mourning clothes, black clothes had been sent out for her. And when she arrived at precisely the point, the place where her coffin arrived, she stepped down from that aircraft to be met by her first Prime Minister, the great wartime leader, Winston Churchill, with his entire cabinet. And so that was the beginning, and that was the beginning of the end. And what we saw was utterly magnificent. The world saw it. And I'm reminded that that was 1952. In 1962, I wrote my first royal story. I was 19, I was on the local paper, and I think it was about the Duke of Edinburgh arriving in a helicopter to open a playing field or something of that kind. I didn't become the royal correspondent of the BBC until 1985. During the intervening years, I'd done royal stories as reporters like you and I always did. I remember at home and abroad going with Prince Charles to the Calgary Stampede, the famous rodeo in Canada, and going to Berlin with the Queen Mother visiting the Black Watch Regiment. But in 1985, my editor, Ron Neal, very famous in Britain because he was the editor of Esther Ranson's program, That's Life, for many years. And then he launched Breakfast Television, about which, Anne, you know everything. And then he said to me, he was a sort of sentimental Scotsman. He said, Michael, I want you to be my royal man. I want the royal coverage being really good now, you know. So I said, well, Ron, if I'm going to be the royal correspondent, I have to tell you that you cannot report from a kneeling position. The normal standards of journalism, probity, truth, attribution, they all have to apply. I said, you're volunteering me for this job, but I will do it. And I didn't mind doing it. I went around the world with Her Majesty the Queen and other members of the royal family, and always using the Mark I eyeball and the very acute ear. You hear and you see everything. But in my very first week as the royal correspondent, the newspaper story had a splash headline, Queen Heart Scare. So Ron said to me, is it true? Can you stand this story up? So before I could ring a friendly cardiologist in Harley Street to find out what the trouble might have been, the Queen answered this. In fact, she killed the story stone dead. She was in Aberdeen on the northeast coast of Scotland, and there was a lighthouse, and she sprinted up 92 steps with men behind panting. She was showing the falsity of the story. And the following year, we were in China, and we went out to the Great Wall of China. And the Queen made sure that all her courtiers, even her personal servants, were out to see this great, wonderful edifice, the only thing that can be seen on Earth, man-made from space, the Great Wall, even including Bobo, her famous and faithful maid, the only one she really trusted with everything. And so the Queen started climbing the Great Wall of China, which is very precipitous in places, very, very steep. And she went up it like a chamois, and she was clicking away with her gold-plated Leica, taking pictures.
Yes. And
all the courtiers were falling about, and she was still going in the general direction of Mongolia when her private secretary said, please come back, please come back. So she was demonstrating for the age of 60, which she then was, but she was very, very fit and able to do long days when most of her job was smiling, listening patiently to people, giving people their moment in the sun. And if somebody said to me, what did I admire about her? Well, I admired her fantastic patience. She's much more patient than I could ever have been. I remember we were in Barbados on a nice sunny morning, and the Queen's job was to open a new cement plant on the West Coast. And we went there, and there was this nice young man in a smart brown suit and a tie. And it was his moment, and he was going to explain how to make cement. So for 40 minutes, he explained with slides how you make cement. And eventually he stopped. And I started thinking about, well, that would be a nice time for a drink before lunch. And the Queen, everybody relaxed. And then the young man said, and of course, then there is the other way of making cement. And the Queen did not flinch. She continued to stand there on her little size 4 shoes and listen attentively, rapt, fascinated by the second way of making cement. So she had that great courtesy. Punctuality is the courtesy of kings and queens, and the only thing she ever was upset about was being late for anything. And it was very, I mean, when we were on abroad on tours, everything ran on Queen's time, So if they published a little blue book, and if it said in the little blue book at 1 o'clock, the Royal Yacht Britannia would be entering Bahamian waters, and at that very moment she would be sitting down to lunch with 4 of her Commonwealth Prime Ministers. At 1 o'clock precisely, those 4 politicians would sit down with the Queen, and silently and seamlessly the first course of lunch would be served. It went like that, and it was a privilege to be there, and extraordinary things happen from time to time.
Oh yes, I mean that image that you remember of her up the getting up the Great Wall of China. I remember seeing probably one of your reports on that, with her reaching into her handbag and pulling out a little camera, and she actually got Prince Philip, move a bit over there so that she could get. I had never seen her take a picture before, but apparently she did it all the time.
Oh no, she loved to take photographs. She did. She loved to take photographs, and there was so much. She was a human being, we mustn't forget that. She had an extraordinary life. I mean, can you imagine? You're born in 1926, which in Britain was the year of the Great Strike. And the BBC was only 4 years old. The Irish Free State was 3 years old. She never went to school. She was taught by tutors. When she joined the Brownies, the Brownie Pact came to her. At the age of 10, when her beloved uncle David, who was Edward VIII, abdicated for the love of Mrs. Wallis Simpson and went into exile, she became the heir apparent. And from that day on, she knew her destiny was there to be, in due course, the Queen. And in 1947, on a tour of South Africa, she made a pledge to serve the country and the Commonwealth for as long as her life may be it long or short. So 75 years she did that. Her father, George VI, reigned for only 15 years, and she took over in 1952. But thinking back to that trip to China, which she had prepared for meticulously, it's not for me to be proud of the Queen, but I was proud of the Queen on many occasions. And standing in the Great Hall of the People in a beautiful silver gown with her garter, sash and star and a tiara, and speaking to the hierarchy of the Chinese Communist Party, people that her eldest son, Charles, had previously described as ghastly old waxworks, which was hardly diplomatic, and pulling it off. And then, having made this great speech, standing there all alone, I wanted to sort of, support her all alone. And then she had to sit down. And what was for dinner? Sea slug. Would you like to sit down and eat sea slug? She did. But, she was a remarkable woman. And sea slug wasn't probably the worst thing that she ever had to eat. When Belize in Central America was the last Commonwealth country. She'd never been to it, so she wanted to visit Belize. And a visit had been impossible because there was a confrontation with Guatemala, which was claiming some Belizean land. But eventually peace was established, and the Belizean story with Guatemala was another one which I had covered. And eventually she came, and I got there fairly early, and I looked at the banquet, because there's always an official banquet, and there was something strange on the menu. And we said, well, what is this? And they said, oh, well, there was a bit of euphemism. They said, it's a jungle rodent. So I said, it's a rat then. So they said, yes, it's a big rat, but it's a very tasty big rat. So, of course, my producer, who was an excellent man called Gordon Carr, he managed to buy one of these rats, and we cooked it and ate it and all. And I stood there and watched this thing being killed. And of course, when she came, she ate it. I think she moved it around her plate quite a lot and didn't really have too much of it. But she went through the motions of eating the great delicacy of Belize. And the Sun newspaper, one of our biggest selling tabloids, did publish the headline, "Queen eats rat." It was true. It was true. It was a blessing to her that she liked people and she knew people. And she was interested. She genuinely was interested in things, and she took a great delight in it, hence the camera. And there was an incident, a terrible incident actually, where a man called a petty criminal called Michael Fagan broke into Buckingham Palace, and he managed to get not just to the royal sleeping quarters, but actually into her bedroom. And she woke up to find this man holding a very heavy glass ashtray, and he appeared to be bleeding. And she pressed the panic button and nothing happened, and because the policeman had gone off duty to have a cup of tea, the man who should have been standing outside her door. And so she had to deal with this human being who'd wandered into her private sleeping quarters until her maid came in and said, more or less told the man to get out of it. And afterwards, the maid said to the Queen, "Well, that was amazing. How did you manage to cope with that terrible situation?" And the Queen said, "Well, you don't realize I've spent my whole life talking to strangers." And she was able to cope with it. And she was immensely resilient. And really, on a more serious matter, after I had ceased to be a royal correspondent, I still obviously looked at what she was doing, and I never admired Her Majesty the Queen more than when she made a state visit to Ireland, which was very, very difficult to do at the time, bearing in mind centuries of trouble between Britain and Ireland. But she went there, and it wouldn't have mattered if a politician had gone, not at all. It mattered because she was the granddaughter of King George V, who had signed the instrument in 1922 that created the Irish Free State, that in turn became ERA, that in 1949 became the Irish Republic. And she went there, and she went to Croke Park, which is the Gaelic football ground where the first Bloody Sunday had happened, where British troops had shot several Irish patriots. And she went to the memorial to the martyrs of Irish independence, and she bowed her head, and she said some sentences in Erse, the language, ancient language of Ireland. And she won over Ireland, and she went to Cork, there's no more Republican city than Cork in the southeast of Ireland. And she went to the English market, and she completely wowed people in her green coat. And it was a magnificent thing. And she didn't need to do it. I mean, even before the current troubles happened in 1966, 68, the troubles really began. She'd been in Northern Ireland, and a builder on a building scaffolding, dropped a huge building block, which made a great dent in the bonnet of her motor car. It was always very difficult, but as often as she could, she went to Northern Ireland. She's a great peacemaker. She thought the best of people. She was guided by her abiding faith in God. She thought that everything would become all right in the end.
Yes, I suppose she was the embodiment of keep calm and carry on. But you mentioned that wow factor. Even President Macron said just before the funeral, he said, to you, British, she was your queen. To us, she's the queen. And so many other world leaders said something very similar. She's always been there. She feels like our queen. She ain't just yours, sort of thing. Why did she have that global appeal?
It's very difficult to say, but if you believe in the power of goodness, which I do, I think that virtue has a validity that cuts through. And people could see that she didn't have an agenda. She wasn't a politician on the make. She wasn't asking for your vote. She was just bringing to whatever forum she happened to be in the goodness and the goodwill. She was the personification of kindness. I think that's the best way I can explain it. Let me just say, Anne, she wasn't grand at all. The job was grand. She was personally modest, and she didn't think she was wonderful. Her closest friends, and she had a few, would say that she never thought she was wonderful. She was an ordinary woman in an extraordinary job. If somebody said, you know, people used to say, "Do you know the Queen?" And I said, "No, I don't know the Queen, but she knows me." She had to know me because I was reporting on her for the BBC, and she had to know everybody of that kind who was there. As her press secretary, Michael Shea, at the time said, 50% of her job was being seen. And at heart, she was a countrywoman, most at home, wearing a pair of old jodhpurs and a hacking jacket with an Hermes scarf tied under her chin, riding down to the Royal Stud at Sandringham, near Anmer Hall, where the new Prince and Princess of Wales live. And she would go in and watch the finer points of the stallions covering the mares. There was nothing about breeding thoroughbred horses that she didn't know or didn't glory in knowing. That's what she was happiest doing. That's the sort of person she was. And she was very unassuming, and she was not the slightest bit vain. I mean, she was a strikingly beautiful woman, young woman. She'd been a very pretty baby, and but she was not a fashion plate. She never wanted to be a fashion plate. Her hats, the jewels, the coats, the costumes, they were the props of a role that she played for many years, and she played it to perfection. I don't think anybody can say that. She never was a slave to fashion. She followed it. I mean, when the 1960s came around and skirts went sky high, then her hemline went up a bit above the knee, and then it came down a bit below the knee. And she was never extreme, but she kept in tune with the times. And over the years, I think the coins, because it was such a long reign, I think her profile on the British coins changed, I think, 4 or 5 times. I think it's 4. And you know, she aged like the rest of us. Apart from you and me, we stay the same age, but other people age. And that's the sort of person she was. And it was a privilege to follow her around the world. I mean, there were some funny moments. I mean, somebody that you and I both know, a former and very nice woman, Julia Somerville, yes. Who was a newsreader on television. She said to me, she did the unforgivable thing. She laughed during a news bulletin because from New Zealand, my intro was something like this. The Queen was up early this morning. It's not very often she gets invited to open a swamp, you see. So she was opening a primeval subtropical swamp. So, you know, there were odd things like that, you know. And on royal tours, quite often, I mean, I give greatest praise to the directors I worked with. I had a wonderful man, a Yorkshireman called Gordon Carr, and we went to St. Kitts, and the Queen was coming to St. Kitts, a beautiful little island in the Caribbean. And one of the greatest things in its history, there'd been a battle between the French and the British on a fortress called Brimstone Hill. And for once the British had lost, but they'd fought so nobly that the French allowed them to come out of the fortress, surrendering, but with their colours flying and their rifles still on their shoulders. And so this was a story that I was going to tell because Brimstone Hill was all there. And my director and producer, Gordon Carr, said, we were staying in a very modest small hotel, and he said, I've got a calypso band coming down in 10 minutes. So I said, why? He said, well, there's a calypso that tells the whole story of Brimstone Hill and the battle and the British and everything. I said, that's fantastic, Gordon. That's great. I don't have to write 2 minutes of script. We've got the whole story in the Calypso. So he said, yeah. I said, that's amazing. What a piece of luck. He said, no, it's not a piece of luck. I wrote the Calypso. So he, yes, he'd written the Calypso for the band, so that we had, and of course, I'm sure it's in the repertory of the band forever, a great Calypso. So he was a very talented man and very, very brilliant. I mean, we were on this trip, and the Queen arrived on an aircraft, and of course we had to film the arrival, but then the main event was downtown, and the press people said to me, well, you cannot go in front of the royal cavalcade, you cannot go in front of the royal car. So I said, well, how can we be at the airport and be there to film the main event when she gets welcomed? He said, well, you can't. So Gordon said, oh, yes, we can. There was a canal beside the road, the main road, and he hired a speedboat. And we filmed the arrival at the airport. We got in the speedboat. We raced down. In fact, we saw the royal car. It was riding beside us. We got to the town, clambered up the bank, and were there in time to film the great arrival. And the Queen did look at me as if to say, you've done pretty good. You know, they recognized that you needed enterprise to properly cover the story.
So even though you were the BBC royal correspondent, they don't necessarily, when you're on a royal trip, they're not necessarily always looking after you. You're expected to go out and just, you know, work hard to try and get a royal story, even though you're part of the entourage, or maybe you're not actually part of the entourage.
No, you're there. You're part of it, but you're separate at all times, and quite rightly so. I mean, sometimes the places that the royal family are going to are very inaccessible, but I was never offered a trip on the royal plane. I think mainly because they guard their privacy very, very high. But there was one occasion when I was quite glad not to have been on the royal plane, because after that famous visit to Belize, the Queen took off in a beautiful BA, British Airways aircraft, going home. And the captain of the aircraft said to Her Majesty, would you like to ride up front with me? Because he said, Belize has got the second most wonderful coral reef in the world. The first is, of course, the Great Barrier Reef of northeast Australia. But Belize has got a fantastic coral reef. And so the plane took off, and the captain flew very low over the coral reef so that she could see it. And while this was going on, it took some time, all the courtiers were in the back saying, oh, what a wonderful visit it had been. They're all having a gin and tonic and enjoying themselves and socializing. And eventually the coral reef ran out, at which point the captain did that, and to take the plane up to its cruising height. And all the people in the back ended up in a great heap, which of course greatly amused the Queen. She liked occasionally things to go wrong, and she actually quite liked to be caught out. Sometimes there was a Commonwealth Heads of Government conference in Nassau in the Bahamas in 1985, and the Prime Minister of the Bahamas, Lyndon Pindling, decided to take 11 of the Commonwealth Heads of Government on a booze cruise around the island. And they got back to the harbour. I filmed all this very late, looking slightly the worse for wear. And they staggered up the gangplank of the royal yacht. By this time, the Queen was slightly fuming because she likes punctuality, and mainly because she didn't want the dinner which had been prepared by the royal chefs to be spoiled, because she knew that they would be so disappointed. But at a Commonwealth conference, there always has to be the big family photograph.
Yes.
And the Queen was getting everybody, trying to make up some time, getting everybody in their position before she took up her position. And eventually she got all of the recalcitrants, the latecomers, she got them all there, sitting down, more or less smiling, to the banks of cameras, including ourselves. But the press secretary, Michael Shea, was standing between the cameras and the subject of the photograph, the group. She said, Michael, you're in the way, get out of the way. And she realized that we were filming, and she burst out in this wonderful smile. And she thought, oh dear, I've let the mask fall. Didn't I enjoy it? And it was just a great sequence. It's quite often replayed because very rarely did she let that mask fall. And I think it just endeared us to even more.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people think she never put a foot wrong, or at least that's what we've heard so many times from various tributes in the past week or so. But there were times when generally the world and the public thought maybe she had gotten it wrong. And you think particularly of the way she kept the royal family up in Balmoral when Diana had died, Princess Diana, because back in London and the rest of the world was saying, where are you? We need to see you. We're grieving. And it's almost as though she stubbornly refused to come down to London because she felt she was looking after the boys better up in Scotland.
Well, you've summed that situation up absolutely perfectly. I, of course, was deeply involved in those events, and I remember it vividly, and there had never been an atmosphere like that in London ever. But eventually the royal family entourage returned to London, and rather like this week, the royal palaces were festooned with banks upon banks of flowers that had been left, and also round Harrods Store, all four sides of it, in memory of Dodi El-Fayed and the princess. And the Queen, dressed in black, did not know quite what reception she would receive. And she could quite easily have ordered that the royal cars sweep into Buckingham Palace, but she didn't. She stopped near the Privy Purse gates, and she got out, not sure of the reception she would receive. And one of the crowd, in fact, it was a man, stepped forward with a single rose and gave it to her. And she said, yes, thank you, I'll put it with the others. And he said, no, it's for you. And I tell you, Anne, that was the moment when she realized that the people were as loyal and as loving and as understanding as possible, because the British people probably have a lot of faults, but they are endlessly forgiving and understanding because they do process these things through their own lived experience.
Yes. Yes, we all make mistakes. And I think certainly over the ensuing years, we've come to understand the terrible dilemma she must have been in. Basically, it was whether to be with her people or whether to be with those boys. And she did the human thing, didn't she, really? And of course, now, all these years later, we saw the same thing almost happen again. King Charles came back to London as king. And I fully expected his entourage to just sweep into Buckingham Palace. But no, he stopped, and he and Queen Camilla got out and shook hands and looked at flowers. And I thought that was extraordinarily brave of them.
Yeah. The walkabout isn't his natural forte, but he realized that that would be a very good thing to do. I mean, Prince William, the Prince of Wales, he's a natural. He's a Spencer through and through. He's his mother's son. That comes well to him. Prince Charles, it's a bit more of an effort, and he's had to learn, but he's learned from a very good teacher,
yes,
his mother. And he's also learned other things. His initial television address, in which he went out of his way to express his love for Prince Harry and Prince Harry's wife, Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, was well judged, as was his decision to allow cameras into the accession council meeting when we saw the workings of the constitutional monarchy, establishing the truth that the monarch reigns but does not rule, and Parliament is sovereign. These are very important ceremonial things, but this is all pageantry with a purpose. It underlines the centrality of the House of Windsor in our constitution, famously unwritten constitution, but it does seem to work. And I've always felt that a constitutional monarchy does suit the British temperament in a way that perhaps other forms of government do not. The important thing is to keep the show on the road, and by and large, that has been the case. It's an old country with old ways, but it adapts as the years pass, and that is very, very, in some part, due to Her Majesty the Queen. And she changed over the years. I mean, she changed her voice, she changed the way she looked. I mean, she was criticized in the 1950s for sounding like a squeaky schoolgirl, and there was some element of that. She spoke with the accents and tones of the upper classes, and she changed, but that was common. I mean, when BBC television started in 1937, I think it was, at Alexandra Palace, the announcers there said, Alexandra Palace, and everybody, they thought they had to be upper class, and that upper class was involved murdering vowel sounds. And I mean, King Charles, as Prince of Charles, was always talking about wearing the right trousers and living at the right. It's a nice house. Well, you know, I think his sons have mocked him for this strangulated upper class bray, and even he has moderated his tones. And it's important. It's only you and me always have spoken exactly as we spoke when we were 10 years old.
Oh, I don't know. I look at old video and I think I sounded a bit squeaky and a bit too posh, as we put it in the 80s. I've mellowed, I hope. But
well, if you listen to my broadcast from the earliest days, 1967 in Anglia, I don't think you would say my voice has changed.
I will. I'll listen back.
Well,
I'll hold you to that. But fascinatingly, I mean, I know that in your career you've also spent a lot of time with Princess Diana, and I just wonder how you feel yourself. I mean, a lot of people have been in touch with me over the last week or so and say she should have been Queen. It wasn't to be. History panned out differently. But what do you think King Charles will be like? Do you think he'll make a good king?
I miss Diana terribly. I think many people do. And the question you asked was one I was asked on television, and I said, it's not a question of whether he will be a good king. He's got to be a good king. It's important for the continuation and the prosperity of this country, the continuation of the House of Windsor. He's got to be. So I hope he has good advisors around him. I think he should get good people around him and he should listen to them. He's said that he will continue in the pattern of his mother. He will follow her example. Well, that's an extremely good thing because she always maintained neutrality. She didn't take sides. She didn't in any way express an opinion that could be interpreted in a political manner. And that's important. He was interviewed about would he continue his lobbying of ministers, writing them black spider letters? Would he be continuing to push issues that were controversial? Because everything, at the end of the day, has a political dimension, and then it has a theological dimension beyond that. So you can't say anything as a monarch which will not be interpreted through the prism of politics. And he said in the interview, he said, of course I'll change. I'm not as stupid as all that. You know, he realized that there was a difference between being a pioneering Prince of Wales, if you will, and a unifying monarch above the fray. And that's important. You know, I also covered around the world the Prince and Princess of Wales, Diana and Charles. And whether we have time to talk about that now, perhaps on another voyage. But it was all very sad. But that was cast, the die was cast there in the first interview. on their day that his engagement to a 19-year-old, don't forget, 19-year-old Lady Diana Spencer. And at the end of the interview, a former colleague of ours called Keith Graves, who was doing the interview for BBC, sort of said, "And in love." And the Prince said, "Whatever love means." Well, if you don't know what love means, you've got no business getting married, because marriage is tough enough. But if you start off and you're not in love, or you're not quite sure what love is, I think it's a hopeless quest. And so after that, 15 years of 50 mainly unhappy years for Diana, for both of them, ended in the inevitability of separation and divorce. And the rest of the story we know. It's all very heartbreaking. I saw it as the marriage was coming apart. The signs were there. These instances which will stay with me forever. Whether you have time on this broadcast to go into it, or you can leave it for another occasion.
Yeah, I think we should. For another occasion. I can just imagine how much our Viking audience will want to hear more, much more about all that. But maybe that's for a cruise. Maybe that would be a better way to do it, because this is still very much about the Queen, I think. And as one, was it the Archbishop of Canterbury said in the service, that we were so lucky to have had her. We sort of thought she would live forever, and yet we knew she wouldn't. So we knew we were going to lose her. But it's sad that we've had to, isn't it?
And he said, "And we'll meet again."
Yes, indeed. Michael, thank you so much. Thank you so much for helping us pay tribute to the Queen, and to look forward as well. And some of your lovely stories, my goodness, how lucky have you been to have those stories banked in there.
We'll meet again. Thank you very much, Anne Diamond.
We will indeed. Thank you very much, Michael Cole. And thank you for paying tribute to Her Majesty the Queen.